Me hit the record button and let's start. Um, this is always a very interesting chapter. Conflict is one of those things that we spend very much of our time trying to avoid many times. And in certain contexts, I certainly agree with that as well. One of the things that this chapter is going to do is probably provide you with a thought of conflict that you've never had before, all right? And to talk about it in a certain positive light. And so one of the things that I like to start out is I want to talk about it, conflict in an example of a way that you may not have considered. So one of my favorite TV shows during the 30s, or excuse me, the 50s, is Perry Mason. And I know there's another Perry Mason on HBO, and I've looked at it, and it doesn't match many of the things that Perry Mason that you have in the drama in the 50s. Perry Mason was written by a very prolific writer by the name of Earl Stanley Gardner. It starred Raymond Burr as Perry Mason, but it also had another excellent actor by the name of William Talman, and he played the DA, Hamilton Berger. And one of the things about the show when you watch it is it's an amazing flow of tete-a-tete interaction between these two individuals. And it's a fascinating kind of study to what you see sometimes going on in the courtroom. I think about this also very fondly with my friend Forrest Danton, who is my attorney. And I thought about him especially. He was a man who was as easy to get along with an individual as I ever could see. But when I saw him in the lawyer's kind of context, certainly I could see him being able to handle conflict and look at it in a much different way than I was. He was the city circuit judge, as I've said before, and he did other, outside work as well. And what I kind of want to show you is a couple of shots of Perry Mason in action, because I think it's quite interesting when you kind of look at it. So I'm going to give you a couple of versions of watching. Now, this is Hamilton Berger, William Talman here as the DA, the prosecution, and Perry Mason as the defense. And so these are some of the I objects that they go through.
I object. Counsel for defense is up to his usual grandstand. Objection. Your Honor, once again, Mr. Mason is demonstrating his characteristic courtroom pirate techniques. Your Honor, it's perfectly obvious that Mr. Mason's been up to one of his usual tricks. Oh, Your Honor, I object. That's incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial. It's also improper cross-examination. I object, Your Honor. This is improper cross-examination. It's incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial, in that it assumes a fact not in evidence.
Objected to is argumentative, assuming a fact not in evidence, leading and suggestive, and utterly incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial.
So you kind of got from all of that, you got a feel for what goes on between them. I mean, this, of course, this is a courtroom drama on a TV show. So now, however, one of the things that you can't see in that is the enormous respect that Perry Mason and Hamilton Berger had for each other. They looked at each other as combatants, but they did not look at each other as enemies. In one of the episodes in season 3, one of my favorites, the district attorney, Hamilton Berger, had a friend who had happened to save his life, who was up for murder. And Hamilton Berger goes to Perry with hat in hand and asks Perry to defend his friend. And so there's some wonderful scenes where, of course, he can't be the DA during this conflict of interest, but he's seeing the other district attorney and Perry going back at each other, and you can hear him whispering under his voice when the DA is objecting, going, oh, shut up, and oh, hush up, and that kind of thing. And then when Perry gets back on him, he'd go, good, Perry, that kind of thing. And so this is just kind of the ending of that particular episode. And I kind of like it because it also states the humanity between the two men and how much they respected each other. Just a quick little ending.
You know, I think I won this case.
Now, what makes that a good scene, and one that I kind of want you to carry this when you think about this chapter of conflict, is both of these individuals want the same thing. And this is also, if you think of our judicial system, both individuals are after justice. It just so happens that one is for the prosecution and the other is for the defense, and they both have a job that they're trying to accomplish, but they're both after the same thing. And so it's one of those things really that I like about courtroom dramas, because it does kind of bring this out. And so with these kind of thoughts in mind, let's move on now and we'll talk about what conflict is. And many times conflict goes or lives within these shared goals between us. And yet, because of the fact that we have independence, we still have conflict. Okay? All right. So let me flip to the beginning and let's start talking about conflict. Okay? So, what is conflict? The first thing I want to mention when I talk about conflict is that even with interdependence, in most situations, conflict exists. It's a normal part of the day-to-day actions and operations between channel members. And so for our definitions, conflict is when the behavior by one channel member is in opposition to the wishes or behavior of the channel counterparts, all right? Now, what kind of behavior does that mean? Well, it can be many things. As we talked about, the goals and missions of the manufacturer are to sell as many of their items as they possibly can. And certainly the retailer, their mission is to be able to sell in a given market area as many possible things as they can. And while the manufacturer wants to sell as many, the retailer wants exclusivity for that particular item in whatever their trade area is. And so this is kind of a natural thing that arises from these different goals, all right? Sometimes the channel actor seeks a goal or an object that his counterpart controls. That can also be in deliveries and in service. That could be another thing. Usually one member of the channel views the upstream or downstream partner as an adversary, or even sometimes as an opponent. It's very easy, it can get to be very easy for Amazon in an omni-channel environment to be looked upon this way if they did not greet all of its partners with some form of relative indifference. If you look at some of the issues happening with some online systems, the fact is that when they start picking winner or losers, that's when you start to see the worst kind of conflict happen, all right? The independent parties, different levels of the channel, contest with each other for control in through shipping or through any of the service outputs that go on in the channel system. As I said before, in the omni-channel context, this can be exacerbated if they were to treat channel partners separately rather than assure some kind of synergy by treating each of the partners the same way, all right? You could create new forms of conflict if you were to favor one channel member versus another, all right? This especially happened when you're talking about online channels cannibalizing the sales of an in-store. So, and this happens when there's a perceived conflict that you're not even sure of that comes about. So when Callaway golf clubs started to sell online in the early 2000s, like 2006 or 7, there all of a sudden was an enormous amount of conflict they had with the pro shops. Pro shops on golf courses don't make a lot of money off of green fees. They make a ton of money off of selling the golf clubs in the pro shops themselves. And when Callaway started to do that, they lost, or the pro shops started to lose an enormous amount of the profit that they generated by having those Callaway clubs out there. So what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the nature of conflict. In other words, its inherent goodness or badness, and we're going to talk about the stages of conflict as well. The first thing, an important thing to note, is that some conflict can actually strengthen and improve the channel, as long as the channel manager deals with it effectively and appropriately. An important point that I'm going to state now, that's an important thing for you to consider later, is that you do not want to minimize conflict. You want to be able to manage it, all right? Conflict needs to be managed, not minimized, all right? And we all have our own strategies in which we go about managing conflict. For me personally, having been through enough in my life, I'm a firm believer of winner take all. And so my feeling is that when I go into a discussion for whatever about a particular problem that I might have, my own personal conflict style is winner take all. If I don't feel that the issue is important enough for me, I'm a firm believer in that whoever has the winning argument should have 100% of my support. I find that compromise can be difficult because compromise leaves open the possibility of, oh gosh, just kind of back channel conversations that are not helpful. So conflict can strengthen and improve the channel. Now, the problem with that is that conflict implies some kind of incompatibility at some level. So we're going to talk about the 4 levels of conflict, and you won't have to write these down right away. We're going to talk about them separately as deepening stages of conflict, all right? So the first is latent conflict, in which you're not even aware of that conflict exists. There's perceived conflict when both sides recognize that there is some form of conflict going on. There's felt or affected conflict when it becomes emotionally involved. And then the worst is manifest conflict. And this is when it is expressed through behaviors. And so without further ado, let us start talking about these one at a time. So the first one is latent. Latent conflict usually exists at such a low level due to conditions such as the busyness of the environment or other reasons that the channel members simply don't sense that there's a conflict there, all right? And what happens sometimes is that each player may ignore whether or not the conflict exists. Sometimes the conflict will disappear if you just ignore it. However, what we find is that many times ignoring it does not get rid of it. What you'll find also is that organizations have a tendency to focus on a few conflicts and ignore others. And those others that are ignored are still there as conflicts in which we're not able or we haven't really dealt with, all right? Now, how does this come up to be an issue, especially if you don't address it? Well, many times what can happen is one channel partner or another can start a fresh new initiative. Let's say next day shipping, or let's say RFID tracking, those kind of things. And if the conflict already exists in some stage that hasn't been addressed, what we find is that might spark opposition from one of the channel partners because there's already a conflict that has been left unresolved. All right. The next level, and this tends to be that level that we really kind of work around, is perceived conflict, all right? Perceived conflict is when a member senses an opposition, that there's a viewpoint or a perception or an interest or an intention. Those kind of things all of a sudden are brought out in the open. Generally, a perceived conflict can be cognitive and emotionless. Mental, it results in a recognition of some kind of contentious situation. I worked in the oil field for 2 years, and there's very much this kind of perceived conflict there, especially when you're talking about the immediacy of goods needed at the moment that they're needed. And so if we were to get some order for an emergency, let's say it's a few hoses that need to be sent by a helicopter to an offshore oil rig, an offshore oil rig actually is not owned, it's rented. And so a corporation like Conoco or Exxon would rent an oil field drilling platform for $400,000 a day. And if that platform is down just because they didn't have a certain hose, you would lose $250,000 just by waiting. And so there's a lot going on in the docks, and there's a lot going on in the helicopters, and there's a great deal of pressure to deliver those goods as quickly as you can. And so this perceived conflict is just part of the business. You get used to this. When I initially started it, I took it in too much of a personal way. And actually, this kind of sharp elbows that you get when you're working with those individuals is just part of the business, okay? Now, you try to express it or sense it with little emotion or frustration. You try to keep things on a professional level. And in truth, this is the kind of conflict that would be considered to be a normal state in marketing channels. That because of the interdependence, but the independence of the organizations pursuing different goals, there is this perception of conflict that's going to be out there. Now, the members don't consider this conflict laden, even though it's despite the opposition. It's just part of the way the job goes, and you accept it as being that way. The next level is when conflict starts to become destructive. And this is what is known as felt or affective, not E, affective conflict. Remember, affective means emotions. And this is when you start to have emotions enter the picture, and we start to have negativity that's built up. If you read anything, or if you've taken any industrial psych, industrial organizational psychology, or OB, organizational behavior, you'll start to see these kind of interactions happen between corporations. You know that the conflict is there, but you start to feel it at an emotive state. It's no longer something cognitive. You feel anger and frustration. You start to personalize it as well. So in essence, what you do is it becomes the corporations start having human characteristics. So the company is rude, they don't care about you as a corporation, and it becomes difficult. What happens also is that the economic considerations of your particular situation fade to the background. And so the economics between the success of your partnership is not as important. It becomes worse, all right? What you find is that the antagonists, as I said, put human features and personal motives into your channel partners so that they become living things, all right? The feelings of outrage and unfairness, they reach a breaking point and it becomes very difficult, all right? And so felt conflict is a very highly charged emotional state, and one in which the channel relationships start to break down. Now, the last one is manifest, and they don't have a slide on this, and so I'm gonna have to go back to this slide to be able to talk about it. And manifest conflict is expressed through behavior. And by this, what I mean is behavior that has very little to do with the actions involved with being a channel partner. And so you start seeing the things like deliberately blocking each other's initiatives, things that you wish to do to augment your particular relationship within the channel to make it more efficient. They will withdraw support from your particular items so that they no longer wish to deal with you. They will, they will push or try to do something to harm your own personal goal achievements of your corporation so that you can't achieve certain numbers that you wish. And manifest conflict is the worst situation of all, because organizations or partnerships go through actions that deliberately hurt each other. Not only do you hurt the partner, but in essence, because it eats away at the relationship, it hurts you as well. In organizational behavior, you'll have this concept that comes up. It's called organizational memory. Organizational memory is the combination of mythos and awareness as a corporation. It is the life history of a corporation. And so when a particular manifest conflict becomes part of the organizational memory, it means that those conflicts are passed down from one employee to the next. And so what happens is that I become an employee of this organization. I inherit the disputes that I incur from my corporation versus another company. And what happens then is that as it becomes part of the organizational memory, it is passed from one organization, or from one person to the next, to the next, and to the next. And so what it means is it perpetuates this conflict from individuals along the organizations until something comes along and ultimately attempts to break that. And this is when it happens and it becomes, in effect, the worst of all states. All right, manifest conflict. So, how do we know, or how do we know how thick or deep conflict is? Well, the way we do it, don't worry about that slide, that's not important, is that we can actually measure conflict in a somewhat esoteric fashion. And so, the way we measure conflict is through 4 steps. The first one is count the issues. Count how many issues we have with another organization. And these are issues that are relevant to both parties. These are relevant to both parties, and it doesn't matter if they're in dispute at the moment, okay? All right, so the first is you count the issues. The next is you assess the importance. Okay. And then assessing the importance, you try to find some way to measure how important it is, okay? And then what you do also is kind of give it a 0 to 10 scale. And of course, the importance is the importance to you as a channel partner and to yourself individually, all right? The third is you determine degree frequency. Determine degree frequency. And that's how often do the 2 parties disagree? Okay. And then the last is you determine the intensity. Measure the dispute intensity. And this is how far apart the partners' positions are. Okay, so you put all those together. And so what you do is you come up with this neat little formula called the index of manifest conflict. And it looks all important, but it's not that difficult to understand. This is the number of issues. So next day shipping, service, support, that's each individual issue. You multiply it by the importance times the frequency times the intensity, and it gives you something of a raw kind of index of knowing just how big an issue this might be. Now, the important thing to understand, though, is that what this helps you to do more than anything else is kind of to help you find some solid ground, okay? So the truth is that no real argument exists if, in terms of importance, it's not important. It might be petty. In terms of frequency, it rarely sparks a difference of opinion. And the third is that it does not create a substantial difference between the 2 parties. And so in other words, it's not an intense disagreement, all right? And if any of these elements are low, then the issue really isn't a genuine source of conflict. And why is this important? Well, the importance sometimes is that many times we attach our own individual importance to a given item. But sometimes we have to think to ourselves, well, how important really is it? Okay? This helps us to look at it in a cognitive fashion, in an impersonal way, so that you can take a step back and consider it from a more broad perspective. And sometimes when you step away from the issue, the truth is it's not that big an issue at all right? It can be something, you may feel it to be manifest, but the truth is that it's more perceived. It's something you can just deal with, okay? All right, so once again, I'm coming back to this thought about conflict. And once again, I want to return to the thought that conflict is not a bad thing. Despite a widespread view of conflict as dysfunctional, in that it harms relationships, coordinated performances, in some cases, opposition actually makes the relationship better. And one of the ways is that it makes the relationship more open, all right? And I'm talking about this, of course, in a way that we're talking about it in terms of channels. So before we go on, when we talked about that first slide in chapter 3, when we talked about functional conflict, I wanted to show you something going back to one of the things that we looked at online. And it had to do, with this. So I talked about the commitment trust theory of relationship marketing. This is that article that I discussed. And I really urge you to kind of read this to give you a deeper understanding of the issues that are involved here. And I wanted to show you that when I'm talking about functional conflict, this isn't something that we're just making up so that we can sell books. So in the model of relationship marketing, if you notice, functional conflict is here, and this is the first article, or one of the big articles, where they started to really deeply conceptualize the whole concept of functional conflict, okay? So if we go to page 8, here's the actual discussion in this article about functional conflict. And so this earlier article by Dwyer, Schur, and O, which is a great article in itself, there's always been a degree of conflict in relational exchanges, okay? The hostility and bitterness resulting from disagreements not being resolved amicably can lead to such pathological consequences as relationship dissolution. All right, we can do away with relationships. So we talked about in chapter 4, where the relationships, all it takes is one to start to dissolve it. However, when disputes are resolved amicably, such disagreement can be referred to as functional conflict. Because they prevent stagnation, they stimulate interest and curiosity, and provide a medium through which problems can be aired and solutions arrived at. Functional conflict, therefore, may increase productivity and be viewed as just another part of doing business. Several works either propose to find that communication and past cooperative behaviors lead to the perception that conflict is functional. They posit, or means that they come up with, the concept that trust can lead a partner to perceive that future conflicts can be functional. Past cooperation and communication result in increased functionality of conflict as a result of increasing trust. If I trust someone, if I trust that individual, I can get in an argument and the argument doesn't have to be destructive. Anyone who saw the Avengers or any of them in the MCU knows what it's like to watch people argue with each other and know that the arguments can be good, all right? That you have sharp elbows with each other, but it brings about resolution of problems. And this is what this article states, and it's what your book states as well, when the conflict is what we call functional conflict, all right? Okay, so let's turn back, go back to our slides, and we'll talk about functional conflict. Functional conflict implies that the members recognize each other's contributions and understand that their success depends on other people. They can oppose each other without damaging their arrangement. They communicate more frequently and they communicate more effectively. They establish outlets for expressing their grievances. They can review each other's past actions without having concerns that they themselves are going to be personally attacked. They can come up with some more equitable split of system resources as well, a better share of the pie. They can develop a more balanced distribution of power in their relationship and a standardized way of dealing with future conflict and keep it within reasonable bounds. Conflict is functional when it drives the channel members to improve their performance, all right? Conflict is functional when it drives channel members to improve their performance. Now, I'm not saying it's easy, all right? Because the difficulty is that it's not easy with human beings to get along with such an equitable fashion, all right? From the downstream perspective, functional conflict is a natural outcome of close cooperation with a supplier, all right? And so in a downstream partner, working with a supplier, it is just the price of doing business. Sometimes cooperative relationships can be noisy, can be contentious, but as long as they work together, they can alleviate disputes instead of just create them. When you have a commitment, we talked about commitment trust, and when there is a commitment, conflict is tolerated and even welcomed. It's a way to ease or to air grievances. Now, it is often also when you have a friend who is what we call disputatious. Disputatious, it is a new word for you today. And disputatious as a definition means fond of creating heated arguments. And boy, we've all got that friend that has one beer too many and starts on this route. Well, disputatiousness is not necessarily a bad thing if it finds some way of being able to resolve grievances. And a lot of great science has been hatched from disputatious relationships of individuals who are willing to crack a few heads to be able to bring science and knowledge a little bit further, all right? Now, here's the worst part about it, okay? That if you don't have this, harmonious relationships may be infected with an even worse word, indifference. Indifference is bad? Well, yeah, indifference can be real bad, all right? You know, an indifference basically can mean that you don't have any issue with anything, that you don't have a strong opinion about anything. It's different from saying winner take all, because you may have a strong opinion about it, but you're willing to accept that another opinion, you're willing to go along with that. Indifference just means I don't care at all right? And what can happen is in an indifferent relationship, you can be guilty of neglect, which is even worse. And even worse, the worst times I have found when I work for a living, I've been laid off 4 times. I found that when I was being treated with indifference by my employer, that's when I knew things were going wrong, all right? When they're treating you with a relative indifference, it means that basically your input is no longer part of their overall future. And so indifference is not necessarily a good thing. Indifference can be an asset as much as you know, anything else can be, all right? The two things that are the most important is communication and cooperation. And the truth is that in the long run, is that if you have communication and a cooperation, eventually you're going to find something that you do disagree with, all right? It's just the nature of things, all right? The most important thing, however, is as I've said before, that conflict, when it is best, these are the good things that conflict can do. When it becomes the felt, affective, or the manifest conflict, which we'll talk about on Thursday, that's ultimately when we start to have the erosion of our relationships, and eventually we'll go on. Okay, I'm finished with this for today. We're going to do probably 3 lectures on conflict because there's so much in it. You'll find on the syllabus, you'll find a discussion about a position paper. We won't talk about that until Thursday. The next test is not this Thursday coming, but the next Thursday. And I think I'm gonna do it as an online test as well. I'm just gonna go ahead and continue to do it in the same way. I don't want to break things up. So is there any questions that you have? All right, folks, have a great day, and I will see you here online on Thursday. Thank you.
Thank you.